Hey,
James cannot do an intro. Do it. You do this right now. Do it.
hey guys, this is Tim and James from Tabletop RPGs Beyond the Rules.
That's not who we are.
.com
Nope.
/ Bounded Accuracy.
Never.
Our videos episode. This is not a video.
This is Tim and James with Tabletop Terrors, and today we're going to talk to you about 3 ways to reinvent skill checks. Now,
Specifically, varying degrees of success and failure, as evidenced in this intro, where I vary degreed failure.
we rolled poorly. Enjoy. All right, so in a lot of tabletop RPGs, dice come into play. Now, it doesn't matter which system you're using. In most cases, there's some kind of dice. So here's my question for you as a game master. How do you decide when the dice come into play and when you just let players narrate something?
Okay, so that's actually interesting because I do not have a very good system for this. I am currently working on trying to get players to roll the dice more. Sometimes they'll ask me a question and I worry a little too much, like I don't think about what the check means. I'm like, no, I think your player would, or I think your character would know that, and I just tell them, and I'm like, yeah, but a check could mean remembering something, you know, that they saw a long time ago, or so for me, deciding when is, I don't know, I have a hard time with that. I actually deciding when needs to be more often. It's not nearly often enough for me.
See, and I think a lot of game masters have problems with when do you use skill checks, when do you use combat. No, that's probably bad. What I mean to say is, in combat, what do you make people roll for? Acrobatics? Do you let them jump over barrels? Do you let them do those things narratively, or do you call for a check? And so here's what I want to talk about in this particular recording today. I want to talk about a couple of ways to reinvent and rethink how to use dice rolls so that you can get the narrative outcome you're looking for. Because I have the same problem. Have you ever done this? You're trying to involve the players and have them roll more, but then they roll abysmally.
They roll really poorly, and you're like, well.
You're like, oh man, okay, I really want them to hear this noise. So instead of just saying, you hear a faint noise, you go, roll. And they're like,
roll for
critical
perception.
failure. Yeah. And
Yeah.
well, and then you're like, oh, okay. Okay, you don't hear anything.
So actually, and this happens a lot, I feel, for me. A lot of times I will say things to you, especially in these recordings, that I don't realize until that moment, and then I feel stupid about it. I feel like skill checks, especially in combat, but in a lot of other cases, should come into play when the character needs to do something more than a normal person would need to, or rather, more than a hero would.
Right.
So, in your example, if somebody said, I want to jump over the barrel to get to the enemy, 10 feet after the barrel and attack them, I would say, okay, and I would narrate how they jump over the barrel. Because they might trip, but they've jumped over barrels, and there's nothing opposing them. The barrel jumping, at least. Now, if the guy is on the other side of the barrel, I'm like, yeah, if you want to jump on top of that barrel to swing, he's going to be taking swings at your feet. Roll something for me to make sure that, he doesn't chop your legs off.
Like an acrobatics check or like
Exactly.
something athletics check. See, now here's the thing. Okay. Something you said is one of the things I want to talk about. You decided that because the player was so adept at something that you were going to let them do it narratively.
Exactly.
So what if this, and this is just a new concept that I'm going to start trying, and it's something that I thought of actually in the shower the other day. And it was this.
He was performing a strength check.
I was doing push-ups in the shower. But, okay, what if this then? And this might be, look, this is taboo. Some people might think this takes the random element out of the game entirely. But what I'm trying to do is figure out the balance between players feeling adept and not failing something simple that they're experts at. So here's the concept. The concept is, what if someone can do that? We'll use your exact example. All right. Acrobatic, ranger type, someone who's really dexterous. Okay, you can do those things. Now roll a d20. And you could do it modified or unmodified for the degree of success at which you have.
Okay, and actually...
It's combining both. It's taking the narrative, but it's also rolling. And what you do with the roll is you say, okay, you do that. Now roll, and this is how well you do it.
Okay.
And if they get a 1, they look stupid. And maybe there's disadvantage the next attack or something.
And that's actually a really good point, is I think that is something I've done without realizing it, is I don't usually, when a player, maybe, actually, this is probably taboo. I'd probably get flack for this. When a player rolls, I decide the DC based on what they get to some degree. Like, if I'm like, okay, that's relatively hard, probably over 10. But when they roll, I think, okay, yeah, 16 will get you here. You know, if in the same example, in my mind, it would take a natural 1 or, you know, a really bad roll to not still get an attack. If, you know, you're trying to sort of jump over the barrels to attack this person.
Right. Because
if you roll a 15, I'm like, all right, that's, you know, upper echelon. That's pretty good. That is like, to me, 15 is average of like, okay, you're pretty good at this. You did it fairly well. 20 is like, you did it like you did this every day of your life. 10 is like, you slipped a little bit. But if they roll a 10, they're not outright failing, in my mind. If, like you said, they're an adept, dexterous type. And I feel like, to some degree, I try to use that idea. But again, exactly like I said earlier, having not said it out loud or heard it the way you said it, I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, because, okay, so here's the thing. I don't like to call for too many rolls because it can lead to a lot of failures.
Yeah.
Some people might say, well, that's not, you know, what do you mean? That's what's supposed to be part of the challenge. It can also destroy the narrative flow.
Yeah.
If characters are failing at things that they would normally be great at. So, to me, this is sort of a balance in between, right? It's, okay, narratively, now roll to see how well you do it. And I'm going to use an example that's real life for me. I've played a lot of live music. So I've played in several bands. We played out a lot. And, of course, I've made flubs on stage.
Yeah.
Okay? But I can recover from those flubs really fast and almost without any kind of hindrance to the next chord I'm going to play. So it's muscle memory.
Yeah.
It's like, if this ranger has jumped over barrels 1,000 times, he's going to slip every once in a while, but his body is going to correct, or her body is going to correct midair. And while it's not going to be a perfect 20, they might land, say, 5 feet further away than they intended.
Yeah. And to me, I feel like, similar to what you're saying, to me it's like, okay, they did what they're used to doing perfectly, but there was moss on the ground. This is an unfamiliar environment. You know, rolling a fail on a check doesn't mean that they screwed up, that the player screwed up. It means that, you know, any number of things. It means that the monster swung in a way that they didn't expect. Things like that, where it's like, you know, if you were on stage and you're playing live and you, like, somebody put a water bottle where you didn't expect there to be one, and you kind of kicked it and you didn't know what it was, that might lead to a flub. It's like, it's not because you're bad at playing music, it's because something else happened.
Right, exactly. So that's the first thing. So if you're really trying to change your skill checks and how you do it, give a narrative success and then roll for the degree of that success. Because it can look ugly. And that sometimes makes the player feel more realistic, a little more heroic. You know, we'll use the same example just to keep it simple, but jumping over the barrels, if they roll a 2, then it's like, okay, you barely make it, you hit your knee, you know, you're flailing your arms, but you're there.
Yeah.
So there is success.
But actually, real quick, before we go to and I think this may be what you're getting to, but the idea is this example specifically applied to somebody who does that all the time.
Exactly. So, well, one thing I want to say is, I think, to me, this is just the style, if it's a critical 1, you're always going to fail.
Well, and
in my game. And if it's a critical 20, you're always going to succeed.
And I think that's the important part, is, to me, like I said, if you rolled a 5 as a ranger, I'm like, you're not getting over those barrels, man. Like, you ran into them. You might still be able to, like, recover and get an attack on that turn, but you didn't do it. Like, to me, like, you failed. But by fail, it's not like, yeah, you're still where you started. You're just like, I mean, you failed forward to some degree.
Exactly. And there is a fail forward mechanic to this, like, entirely. But that leads into, because some people might hate that. They might hate that whole thing we just said. They're like, well, why would you give people automatic successes? There are times where the game dictates it.
Yeah.
I think. I wouldn't use that all the time. In fact, I would use it less than half the time. But there are times where it would make perfect sense to use that instead of killing narrative play.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what happens if, let's say, your wizard is studying this magical item and rolls a 3? Okay? 3 on his Arcana check. He doesn't know what it is. She doesn't know what it is. I don't know what this thing is. They got it upside down. They're calling it a dinglehopper. Then the fighter, 0 ranks in Arcana, intelligence score of 10, comes over, rolls a nat 20 on their Arcana check. Here's the way I've started handling this. A fighter's 20 is never going to be the same as a wizard's 20 in Arcana.
Exactly.
You're a web programmer, right?
Yeah.
If I stumble upon some HTML and happen to know one little string of characters, in that one instance, I might have rolled a 20.
Exactly.
If I spot an error in your code,
yeah.
I'm like, hey, what's that extra character there? But that's not going to be the same as you who are like, oh, no, I know all this code.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's degrees.
It's degrees, yeah, not just on the check necessarily, but like you said, it depends on what they're good at. Somebody who's not good at something that rolls well, that's like them literally getting lucky. Like, no, you did it. Somehow you managed to do it.
Sure. And you can explain that like, well, no, the fighter's seen this in a book before.
Exactly.
Or he's heard a story about it, or it's,
And in that respect, I think that it makes for really interesting narrative play and a lot of fun because your wizard, reasonably might get upset that like internally, like, oh man, I should have known that. And the fighter's like, oh yeah, no, we saw those all the time back in my day. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, that makes for an interesting story.
So let's flip it around. Is a wizard's 17 on a strength check going to be the same as a barbarian's 17 on a strength check?
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's not. A wizard, well, depending on what the wizard's strength is, but
that's
a
true.
good way
That
to
is very
classify.
true.
I was going to say.
I'm archetypically stereotyping.
Exactly. So to be more specific, the idea is you mentioned specifically the intelligence of 10 on the...
So let's say a wizard with a strength of 10 versus a barbarian with a strength of 17.
Exactly. And I agree completely that it's like, it's not going to be the same. It's just not going to match up because in the same respect, there are certain things that I wouldn't let the wizard lift, but the barbarian absolutely could. I'm like, no, you're just not strong enough. Now, depending on what the check is, you might be able to hold something, or you might be able to, get under a door that's closing and hold it, just barely for everybody to get out because you rolled well. But in the same respect, I'm like, no, you can't use that giant's sword because you're just not strong enough.
And this comes up. I've seen this happen in so many games where the DM or GM calls for a roll, and the character outside of who you'd imagine would win or get highest roll gets highest roll. And then it's like, oh man, okay. All of you dexterous types, miss the save.
Exactly.
And the brawny dwarf happens to get out of the way. That's going to happen every once in a while. But I like to apply a relative success and failure based on what they're really adept at.
Exactly. And actually in that example, especially the dex save, because I'm like, to me, you make that or you don't, if it's say like a monster. But I love that you're like, even though you're the dwarf that, barely moves, that probably has a negative or a disadvantage on dex saves because you've got heavy armor or something. It's like, no, you saw it coming. You know what I mean? Whatever it might have been, that makes for such a cool, interesting story because it wasn't normal. It wasn't,
exactly.
Oh yeah, all the dexterous types got out of the way and there was the dwarf just getting burnt by the dragon. It's like, no, dude heard a dragon, so he rolled out of the way as unadept as he may have. He crouched behind a barrel where you guys were just caught out. I love that.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk about one final thing, which is if you have these relative degrees of successes and failures, meaning a strong person's 20 isn't the same as a weak person's 20. If you kind of think about that at the table, and if you also have, like what we were talking about before, narrative success and then roll to see what actually happens, like how good or bad the success is.
Exactly.
Then there's one other thing I want to talk about. And this has come up a couple of times I've seen in the Facebook group or the other things that we're a part of, where people will say it's really fun sometimes to fail.
Yeah.
Because the failure is, I think, part of what makes you feel heroic in the end, because if you fail a few times and then succeed, it's more valuable.
Absolutely.
So, I guess what we're getting at is, if you roll a 17 and hit the creature, there's no rule that says that it has to be a good, clean, awesome hit.
Absolutely.
Meaning, have you ever, in any sport, just been at the right place at the right time?
Yeah.
It's like, every once in a while, I like to throw one of those in narratively. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, you hit an 18. Well, what if you were going for the arm, and they turn into your sword. And that's why it's an 18.
Exactly. And again, it makes for those really interesting situations where it is that. It's like, oh, you were trying to do this, but then this happened. He stepped out of the way because of something else that happened. Exactly what you said. It's just, it can be a lot of fun because it doesn't all come down to what you're doing.
Right.
In the same respect, it's like, oh, you thought it hit off of his armor again. It glanced off his armor, but it slipped and, got between the plates. And you did still hit him. It wasn't like, yeah, you crushed his armor. It's like, no, you probably have a dagger, it depends on so many different things. But
exactly.
Again, it makes it narratively so much more fun to, like you said, throw in a couple of those every once in a while.
Yeah, so let's, and I'll give you an exact example. Let's say I'm fighting a gnoll, this colossal gnoll. It's really difficult to hit.
Not literally the size colossal. Oh. Well, because that's a size class.
Well, I guess it could be.
Colossal is like, I want to say that's like dragon size.
It is. I'm running up its
a colossal
sword.
Gnoll.
So it's and then I'm fighting this thing, and it just seems like it's extremely hard to hit. And I'm going to town, and it's just really difficult to hit. If I hit a critical hit, this is an example of what I would do. I would say, my axe swings through the air, and the gnoll missteps. His sword and his mace in the other hand just move in such a way that I find purchase directly through the two of them. And my axe hits his chest, and surprising him, he falls back into the mud, or something like that. That was horrible narration. That was terrible. But that's the idea is that I wouldn't say, oh, sweet, critical, I cut off his head.
Yeah, exactly, because you're still barely making it. Even though you got a 20, in the grand scheme of everything that's been happening, you couldn't hit this thing. This thing's been parrying your blows. It's been moving out of the way. It's probably laughing at you at this point. And yeah, you finally get a hit on it, and all of that matters. All of the things that came before the roll matters.
I got to try that again.
Okay.
Can I try that again?
Yeah.
That was miserable narration.
Absolutely.
All right. So, all right.
Round 2.
All right, round 2. The gnoll before me, in his red and gold armor, is not swinging anymore. He's grinning. His fangs and his black gums wrenched back as he knows he has victory. My axe has been unable to find purchase this entire time. And in his cockiness, he swings his sword, sort of in a twirling motion at his side. But he doesn't notice the slick patch of mud under his feet, and he slides ever so much. And that's exactly what I needed. As he takes half a second to regain his composure and tries to bring his sword up to match my axe, his angle is all wrong, and I'm just able to get my axe into his forearm. He drops his sword, howls in terror, and charges me. So that was a little better.
Yeah. And that actually, you saying that brought up a really good point for this and for the previous stuff we were talking about, the degrees of success. It actually reminded me that, and I touched on this briefly, but I wanted to make it clear that it's not always, failing isn't always that you messed up. And it's the same for succeeding. And we sort of touched on that, and I swear I was going somewhere with this. The important thing I wanted to stress was when my players miss, especially in combat, when they miss in combat, the way I like to narrate it is, you miss, and sometimes it goes off the armor. That's part of armor class. Sometimes it's they moved out of the way. But I love saying something when they miss it by 1, like, it's probably because of an insert something that happened earlier here. Like when that character was out of rations. So, they're not necessarily literally exhausted, but they haven't eaten for a while.
They're hungry.
They're hungry. Maybe they didn't sleep too well because of, again, probably narratively, where they just tell me like, oh, my character didn't sleep really well last night because I had bad dreams, and they explain this terrible dream they had, this nightmare. I'm like, okay, that's all cool role play. But it's cool that, okay, they failed. Why did they fail? As a GM, I love throwing that in there. Like, oh, it was probably because, you're a little groggy. You're still kind of waking up. You got ambushed, and the visions of that bad dream you had are still flashing in your head.
I love that. It's like a flash of your nightmare appears immediately, and you can't stop.
Exactly.
But think about the horrible visage you saw, and it makes you stutter step for half a second.
And I feel like it's slowly, I'm realizing it's coming down to using everything at your disposal, everything that happened previous, because in the same way, if somebody slips, it could be because they were just walking in mud earlier. Now,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
die decided whether they failed or succeeded, is the word I couldn't think of.
Right.
But that's where the narration comes in. It doesn't always have to be because they messed up. It could be because there's mud on their boot. Or
I love it.
It could be because they tripped. It really could just, anything can happen, but those degrees make it feel more realistic, I think.
Yeah. And so that's how you can reinvent your skill checks. The first way is allow narrative success occasionally, but make them roll for the degree of success. And then the second thing would be, don't be afraid to have degrees of differences in success. Someone who's very strong would have a relative better roll of an 18 than someone who's very weak.
Exactly.
So don't be afraid of that. And then the third and final thing is, even on good rolls, don't be afraid to narrate difficulty and kind of use the context of everything else that's been going on. For instance, if you've rolled poorly up until then and then all of a sudden hit, use that.
Yeah,
and use
absolutely.
the conflict and the narration to kind of make things more rich. Is there anything you want to throw out there?
No,
Anything
I
else?
think that about covers it.
Awesome. Well, hopefully this helps. As always, you can check us out on tabletopterrors.com. We absolutely want you to like this video, share it, and definitely subscribe if you haven't. And if you want to be a part of anything that we're doing, the best way is probably the Facebook group that we're a part of. It is James and I are part of a publishing company called Absolute Tabletop. James, what's the Facebook group address?
So if you want to find us, the Facebook group address, and this is a group for anybody that wants to come and talk to a community of people that oftentimes run games, answer questions, and just in general are always there for RPG support and knowledge and talking to. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/absolute tabletop. Just ask to join. It's a closed group, but you'll be accepted in there, and then you can start taking part.
Yeah, it's awesome. So thank you so much for listening. We hope this was helpful for you. And until the next time we talk, may your dice roll high.